When we look at what localism is, I guess it's a group of surfers who live in a certain area or a certain break, and as a result of that expect, I guess, a little bit of special treatment for living in that area. And generally, those surfers tend to claim a sort of sense of ownership over that area or that break. Now, let me stop you there, because I don't think that there is one single surfer in the world, no matter how local they are, who actually think they own the waves or the beach or whatever. Even they will acknowledge, along with everybody else, that nobody owns the ocean. This localism, though, I think it might be expressed in ways that are generally received as being aggressive or, I guess, arrogant, and that's what I want to look at today. When locals take waves and ignore general surf etiquette, it makes it tough for everybody else. Now, what I want to point out, though, is what localism might also entail in a more positive light is protecting local beaches from overcapitalisation, organising beach cleanups, regulating lineups in a positive way, so setting a really nice standard and enforcing that standard in that particular place, and perhaps enforcing those more intangible ideologies, such as not sharing locations of those certain wave spots. In this video, I want to look at whether or not localism overall is being applied in a positive or negative way, and I want to sort of suggest some ways in which you guys can actually negotiate such situations. Let's jump into it. This video is brought to you by thesurfersroadmap.com, the go-to for all your surf progression. Since the beginning of 2020, surfing has seen a huge rise in population density across the board. Beaches are packed with a huge range of surfers and surfing abilities, from beginner to pro, sometimes all in an 800-metre stretch of beach. Salty surfer rhetoric sits back and ignores the socio and geopolitical environment to point the finger at you. Anyone who's not them, a local, for posting photos on Instagram, talking about spots to other people, and overall just stumbling into surfing without dragging along the inherent style or ethos that these crusty, rigid souls expect from anyone holding a fiberglass surfboard. Surfing is a weird sport, and I guess localism within surfing is an even weirder concept to fathom, particularly for people who are just new to the sport. I find myself uniquely qualified to chat about this today for the following reasons. Number one, I have a foot in either side of the demographics involved. I'm a surfer of 20 plus years, which, might make me salty, but I'm also someone who coaches beginners through to intermediate, and I really enjoy doing so. Number two, I grew up in South Australia, arguably one of the kind of gnarliest places when it comes to localism. Number three, I no longer have a set address. This here is my home, my van, and at the moment I'm literally a blow-in wherever I go until I decide to settle down. I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'm a fan of localism, conscious localism, if it exists. There's been a lot of talk around localism lately, particularly within Australia, as most of the country finds itself in lockup right now, meaning flexible work hours for many, and those very valued exercise windows, often all taken up at various times of the day and all throughout the day. I've had friends texting me from back east saying the lineups have just become so crazy, and there's been fisticuffs and all sorts of stuff going on, which is really not what you want in any sort of situation in the surf. It takes away the glow, right? So I want to talk about that, but I think this video wouldn't be valid unless we acknowledge what has happened to surfing over the past 24 months and how that has resulted overall in a massive increase in population density out in the water. I was living on the northern beaches in Sydney at the start of all the lockdowns and whatever, when everyone started working from home, and it was almost instantly that we saw a massive surge in that lineup density. Where I'd previously surf alone, At spots where I'd previously surf alone, quite a lot mind you, there were now regularly 5 or 6 people in the lineup who had been displaced from beaches closer to the city, and another 5 or 6 who were freshly faced, freshly waxed newbies taking advantage of their late start time or extended lunch breaks. It happened so quickly that people couldn't quite fathom it. But in retrospect, there were 2 main demographics who represented these extra heads in the water at the local breaks. Number 1, it was the surfers who already surfed but now could work from home and enjoy flexible work hours. And number 2, it was the frothers who had always wanted to surf but had never had the time to. I think that this whole localism thing, we need to acknowledge this phenomena. Never before has surfing seen such an intense rise in popularity in such a short amount of time, and this naturally leads to more tension and more congested lineups. "27-year local, okay." "This is about localism," he said. "Was the drop-in heavy? For sure. Did I know the guy? Not personally. Did I feel good about doing it? Oh, wow. What a saint. Was the wave worth it? Absolutely. Oh, wow, the fist pump and everything." Okay, sure. So, I mean, obviously we're dealing with a sort of typical East Coast local sort of attitude here. And it's not something I typically vibe with, although at the same time I don't particularly care. First off, let me point out, if you paddle out at Snapper or Kira and you expect that not to happen, you are being delusional. When I'm up on the Gold Coast, that is my last resort to surf at the Superbank. It's just absolutely ridiculous, and the attitudes and the toxic mindset out there is a little bit hard to deal with at times. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule. But if you look at his responses, there is obviously that sense of entitlement. I've lived here for 27 years, so I'm going to burn this guy that I don't recognise. Well, what if the guy that he doesn't recognise has also lived there for 10 years, but on the Gold Coast you don't know everyone? Right? Maybe he's just not in the board riders, and then thus he's not a local. So it gets a bit ridiculous in that sense, and I never think that sort of approach is sensible, safe, or respectable. If you're going to drop in on someone whilst they're in the tube, getting a good tube, I mean, in my book, it's a little bit of a dick move. But again, at the same time, you do bring it on yourself to an extent surfing there. It's a ridiculous spot. In Sydney, there were a lot of people like this who kind of were not incredible surfers but thought they were. They lived in the area, had always grown up in the area, never left the area, and just had this like overwhelming need to almost make up for something. And you sort of see that, and that's probably a better focus point. For me, you know, I always looked at it and got a little bit annoyed initially when some of these guys were like paddling around and just catching everything, not just sitting out the back waiting for the good ones, but literally just paddling out, snaking everybody, catching waves, being loud, being over the top, sort of small man syndrome kind of thing. And that's always really ugly for me to see. And to be honest, a better sort of take on that is that these people are just dealing with their own shit. To be honest, they've got issues that they have to deal with. If we look at the psychology of greed, of mistrust, of, you know, that sort of egotism, it's generally not rooted in anything sort of healthy. So actually taking on a more empathic view for the actions that these people are expressing can actually be beneficial. I tend to just have that moment and then just walk away, or just paddle away and try and find my own spot, which is, to be honest, the best way to deal with it. It shouldn't really rest upon you to call out poor behavior like that unless you're really confident. If it's a local and it's a really sort of intense, loud local, chances are they're never going to react positively to you calling them out at their own break. There's just too much dissonance there for them to actually come on board and relax a little bit. That's the worst style of localism that I see. In my eyes, it's unearned positions in the lineup and unrespectable people taking those positions, which is always a little bit cringe and a little bit gross, and it's the sad side of surfing. But what I want to do is look at perhaps, or at least what I see to be, a more positive version of localism. Let's analyse another example, a hypothetical scenario in a more isolated location. Lineups where true locals know every single face in the water, and if they don't know yours, they know you're not a local. I find these scenarios are easier to deal with, and normally the locals in these sorts of locations are the ones who don't necessarily follow general surf etiquette, but they also don't flaunt their localism by yelling at people or dropping in or just trying to dominate the lineup. These are the sort of locals who I can appreciate. They wait for their big sets and they know exactly what wave they want, and then they turn and paddle early to make it known that they want that wave. Interestingly, these are the types of locals I find it easiest to gain their respect with either good surfing, conversation, or commitment to solid waves. This is probably the part of surfing culture that is difficult to understand, but it's almost, I actually think it's kind of cool. Once you prove yourself in a lineup like this, to locals like this, if you will, it all ends up being quite easy, and you start to break through that tough exterior. I think the best way to do this is to catch a great wave, pull into a good tube, or you can try the old-fashioned way with a good conversation. They're not always easy to have, particularly where I grew up, but you really can sort of kill them with kindness, so to speak. And I think even though you might not always break through to those sort of people, generally I find that they do make space for you if you respect the lineup, respect the place, respect their time that they've put in at that lineup. It's almost like these locals in these sorts of areas I find represent like a healthy barrier to entry into those sorts of waves, especially when you're dealing with pumping waves like solid barrels or anything like that. You actually don't want it to be like a sort of utopia, because if you do have beginners and intermediates out in the lineup like that, then it can get pretty chaotic and it can get dangerous. And that's when I think having a really strong local presence in the water can actually mitigate that sort of scenario, and almost encourage those sorts of surfers that I talked about, beginners and intermediates who are maybe out of their depth, to actually sort of make their own call and say, hey, maybe this isn't for me, and I'm probably adding to a troubled situation here. For me, a good local is someone who sets a strict but fair example out in the lineup. Someone who can adapt really well to a suddenly crowded lineup with premium positioning and crowd negotiation strategy, coupled with a confident knowing that this is, in only a metaphorical sense, their break. It's their responsibility to make sure no one acts like a dick. Blow-ins respect the lineup, and people don't step all over the ecology, and to set a great example of how to behave in the lineup, even if it means catching a few more waves than everybody else. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments your thoughts on localism. There's bound to be some colourful responses, but please make them respectful. Be sure to check out thesurfersroadmap.com, your go-to for all your surf progression, and I'll see you in the next video.